everyone, and welcome to King Arthur and Lady of the Lake. It is session 4 for us, and today we've got an excellent topic: battle scars and the war within. What do you think about this one, Michael?
I'm looking forward to this, Helen. I'm very much looking forward to this. Tell us about what we're going to be talking about.
Well, this topic is something I've had in my mind for a little while. I find when I look at kind of where we're at now and people talking about, you know, how they were parenting and some of the traumas that have happened and where we see ourselves as a society kind of battling each other and there's personal attacks and kind of a lot of bad behavior. And I look back to where we're from. And when I look at what's happened universally since like the 1900s, we've gone through 2 significant like world wars, massive like years of war and death and battle and trauma from that hasn't been resolved or processed in a day where people just got on with it. And the men who came back from war were obviously traumatized from what they'd seen and didn't talk about it. And there was a lot of drinking or silence, or, you know, domestic violence was normal. And also on top of that, then the women who'd kind of held up the fort and had this incredible experience of literally running the country outside of the men being in war. And I look at that as that we're kind of wearing the battle scars from that period of time, that those men who were in the war in the 1900s then became either the fathers or grandfathers of, you know, children born in the 40s, and then those men then were the sons and daughters of men who went to war in the Second World War, etc.
Yep.
So I just find that really interesting, that now I think we're really looking at the consequences of that, and there's no battle that we're fighting necessarily now outside, but the battle seems to have gone within, and we're really battling all of the kind of ancestral damage that has caused.
It's interesting you use that word ancestral, because I have been writing some things down that I want to touch on while you've been talking. And one of those things is ancestral wounds. And I've heard a lot about this. I've heard a lot of this in men's work, because there's a lot of stuff around ancestral wounds. And whilst it's very easy to use that stuff as almost victim language, it's like, well, I can't do that and I can't take responsibility because I have all these ancestral wounds I need to figure out first and deal with. I do think that there is some validity in that as well. Not in not taking responsibility, but definitely when we think about these men who are going to war, who went to war, First World War, Second World War, the Vietnam War as well. And we have to think about what they may have experienced and what they saw and the adversity and barbarism that they must have experienced and been part of. And then that stuff doesn't go, like, you can't unsee things and you can't unexperience things, can you? And I think when you would come back from an experience like that, there would be some emotional trauma around that. And I am pretty certain that back in the, you know, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, we didn't know as much about psychology as what we do now. Things like PTSD and ongoing emotional trauma and those things, and how they can actually affect a person and then affect their thinking and how they feel and then their behaviors. And so then you talk about domestic abuse, right? And women being, and it was, back then it was more women who were the victims of domestic abuse, because these men were coming back from war and they were so deeply traumatized by their experience and they didn't know how to deal with it. And there was no real emotional help or proper emotional help, really. And so that real unintegrated, aggressive, masculine energy would come in, and it would be externalized as violence, you know? And so I think there's a lot to be said around these emotional battle scars. And then when we speak into ancestral wounds, this is ancestral wounding, isn't it? Because these men suffered, and women then, as a result, were at the hands of these men who were emotionally suffering. And then there's all this ancestral stuff. I'd love for you to speak into that a little bit, because I think you give some good perspective around that.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, and when you look at the role that women played as well. I mean, we'd just come out of like the late 1800s, the suffragette movement started. And then into like right from 1900 to 1910, there was huge movement in that era. But it wasn't actually until 1918 that the suffragettes were awarded the vote for women. But what people don't realize about that is that actually no working class men were allowed to vote either. It was
Mm,
only top ranking, professional, kind of well to do men were allowed to vote.
yep.
So the reason they really gave women the vote is because there wasn't enough men in the country to vote in the election.
Right. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't know that.
So
Yeah.
so
Okay.
they actually granted the vote to the working class man and to women in
Mm,
1918. And so that was
yeah. Right.
really massively significant as well. And a lot of people don't realize that the working man wasn't allowed to vote either.
Isn't that interesting, Helen? Because we hear so much stuff from feminists, really, where they will make such a point of women were only granted the right to vote in the early part of last century, and I didn't know that. It's like, isn't
Mhm.
it interesting how we pick out bits of history that serve our agenda, and our conditioning and our indoctrination, and et cetera. What we would like for people to believe, and what we've always believed, is that women didn't always have the right to vote, and it was granted to women. What we don't know is that it was actually at the same time granted to the working class man as well. Isn't
Yeah,
that an interesting
yeah,
thing? So when you, yeah,
yeah.
isn't that
But the
interesting?
thing,
Because that's one of the main arguments of the women's rights movement, and also feminism. It's like, well, we weren't always allowed to vote.
but
And
having said that, had the suffragettes not stood up and been in that space, they wouldn't have granted the vote to women. I don't think they would have. I think that there was still had to be a movement by women to
yep,
say
okay.
we need to be recognised.
Do,
So
do you think men would have been granted, the working class man would have been granted the right to vote without some kind of movement?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think men. I think generally that it's the next kind of rung down. It's like, oh, there's no professional men here, so we'll give it to ordinary men. I
Yeah,
think
okay.
that would have always, in that era, have been considered well before women.
Yep.
But I
Yeah, you're
think,
probably right in that. Yep.
with the women coming through and saying, well, I mean, imagine that. Really, you've just given the working class men votes now, and you've still not given us votes. I mean, that would have been disgusting. And at that
Yep.
time as well, you see these women stepping up into these places. And if we look across history of the kind of differences between men and women's roles,
Mm,
um, women who were kind of not well or depressed or something like that, it was that they were ill and they spent a lot of time in their room. They were fragile and all that kind of thing.
yep.
And so we needed these amazing, it's like anything, anything we want to change in our environment, we have to have these brave people who are going to kind of risk everything to make it true.
Mm, mm,
I think it's like anything. It's like anything at all. You get a movement and it needs to happen and it comes through and it changes everything and we all benefit. And then it keeps going to a point that it gets unbalanced.
yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's kind of my thought around that. But with the 1800s as well, coming out of the 1800s into the 1900s, then with that kind of push from the suffragettes, and there was a lot of abuse in that time around that, and the
Mm,
and the whole of the you know that women weren't even allowed in basic areas, and it was kind of like a gender apartheid, wasn't it, really, back in those days.
yeah. Yeah. Definitely. And for people that may not know what that term means, and correct me if I'm wrong too, Helen, but the suffragettes was like the beginnings of the women's rights movement, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yep. Yep.
yeah.
In
It
America.
was
Yeah.
pretty much saying, and it was in London,
Oh,
so
right. Okay. Yep.
yeah, and so they used to kind of tie themselves to Downing Street and all that kind of thing, and it was the Burning Bras movement, and it's epic,
Yep.
and it
Yep.
is, and I don't think we would be where we are today without those ladies doing this amazing thing, but at
Mm,
the same time, during that stage, then women stepped up into these roles where they ran the country and very, very capably. But then the men came back, and it starts that really interesting knowledge, doesn't it? Where the
mm,
man's kind of like esteem comes from providing and from being needed and from,
Yep.
like we've spoke about before. And the women came back, and so there was that dynamic as well, that actually they've done fine without us. But then for women to really be able to enjoy their femininity, it's about kind of falling in and allowing that masculine feminine mix.
Mm, mm,
So
mm.
it's interesting. I wonder how we came out of that. I wonder how
And
we.
I also wonder whether women have battle scars, ancestral battle scars, as we talk about, from those days when it was necessary for them to stand up and fight for basic rights. You
Mm,
know,
yeah.
and there's another school of thought here around when it was sort of in the 50s and the 60s, especially in America, and it was the end of the Second World War, and not as many men came back. And so there was a shortage in the workforce of people, right? Because there was the industrial age. And so what happened was that, and we're led to believe, and I know we're not talking about feminism here. We kind of just rolled into that, didn't we? But from what I understand as well, was that the women's rights movement in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s wasn't so much about women standing up for rights. It was actually a government driven agenda to get women into the workforce, because there weren't enough men to fill the factories, right, and to make the stuff that needed to be made in order for the economy to then grow.
Mm.
So, and then it kind of grew from that, and then women started to be, oh, it's gone dark all of a sudden. I don't know what happened.
I was going to say, you're getting more and more mysterious,
That must
Michael.
be. Could be, Helen, could be. Where was I going with that? So
Yeah,
yeah, and
getting
from what
women
I
into work.
understand, then what happened was that women started wanting to step up into management roles, and that's when things started getting difficult, I think, in the workforce for women,
Mm,
when they started stepping up into these what used to be predominantly male positions, management, supervisors, etc., because most of the workforce was, also part of the workforce was men, part of it was women, and men didn't like to be managed by women back then.
mm,
It
mm,
was it was a
mm,
very sexist kind of thing, and
mm,
I think that's where, but I think we've resolved a lot of that now. To be
mm,
honest, I'm not sure that that's even a thing in society anymore, but definitely you can see it in the real far left extreme feminists, that perhaps there are some ancestral wounds carried over from those times into now, which causes them to believe that there still isn't equality in the workplace, for instance.
mm.
What
I
do you
think
think?
that the equality in the workplace one, look, it's not equal in the workplace. And I'll tell you why my experience of that is true for me, is that it's to do with the dark side of the sisterhood and the dark side of the masculine. Really, it's like there's women and men.
Helen, we're stepping into territory here that's not for another 2 episodes.
I know we're going to talk about it more to the point a bit later. We'll delve into this,
Yep,
but
yep, yep, yep.
we do bring these shadows of our genders into the workplace. So it's not just actually men and women in the workplace, it's women and women in the workplace, and men in the workplace. So there's a lot of dynamics to consider when we talk about equality in the workforce. And I think
Mm.
it's a whole new topic entirely. I think we
I'm
need
going to
to
write that
dedicate,
down as
we need
a
to
different.
dedicate
Yep.
another episode to the workplace, because otherwise we're never going to talk about battle
I'm
scars.
writing this
We're going to end
down.
up going,
I'm writing this down, equality in the workplace, and we'll talk about that on another episode
yeah,
of King Arthur and the Lady of the Lake.
because I think that this may be a topic that we disagree on, Michael.
I think it might be, just based on what you just said, there's been a couple of people that said, I
So
want you to disagree on something, you two, and have a good quality argument or good quality discussion around it. So this could be something that we disagree on, because,
yeah,
yeah, anyway, well, let's not go
yeah,
there. We'll save that
let's
for,
do that another episode.
yep,
But I
yep,
think,
yep, yep.
what's really key about what we're talking about today is that, men and women both went through something traumatic, and both men and women came out with different parts of their personalities amplified from that experience.
Mm,
So I'm sure for women fighting for rations for their children, having
yep,
babies on their own, having bombs drop around them,
Yep.
where while nursing or being in hospitals, women who were nurses, when, you know, I mean, I heard this beautiful analogy of the First World War, and they actually likened it to social media. They said social media now is like World War II. And when we were growing up, interaction between people was like World War One. And I said, what do you mean? They said, World War One, you want to insult somebody or kill somebody, you do it to their face. You had a bayonet and you looked at them as you killed them.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
that was
Yep.
the case. If you want to destroy, then you're looking at them while you're doing it. World
Yep.
War Two, they flew over and they just dropped a bomb on you. You didn't have to see the destruction.
Yeah, and it was very impersonal too. The person dropping the bomb didn't see the death and destruction that they were creating. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this. Yep.
So World War One, not only did these men have like face-to-face battle and see their men blown to bits or stabbed or killed beside them, but
Mm.
then the women were nursing, and they didn't have a nurse training. They became nurses looking after men who had missing legs, who were dying in front of them, calling out for their mums,
Yep.
trying to get messages to their families. I mean, oh my God, can
What
you
a
even
traumatic
imagine?
time that must have been for everyone.
I mean, just awful. And
Yep.
people, like, I know in England, they were giving up the great kind of mansion houses were turned into hospitals and these
Mm,
big
mm.
estates. And so, you know, the memories of these places from right up to the upper class, where they were actually the people that opened their homes up as hospitals. So to come through that, rations of food and fighting to get what they needed for their families, and
Mm.
you know, and I mean, it's just, you know, coming out of that, you know, we have an occasion where something happens now, and they throw all psychologists and counselors at us because we understand trauma.
Yep.
You know, it must have been very difficult, and for women in the day, if they were hit as well, it was almost not worth talking about. There was
Yep.
nobody who said that shouldn't be happening. You know,
There
it's
was it was
kind of
actually
like,
shameful, wasn't it?
you
It was
know, it was
shameful to
like,
even
oh my
admit that you'd
God,
been hit.
I've
Yep.
well, I must have deserved it, or that's
Yep.
normal. It was much more
Yep.
normal, and for children to be abused in that way as well,
Mm, mm.
and a lot of the time, then of course, those children were the fathers of boys born in the 40s, who are then kind of the fathers and now the grandfathers, and so we're
Yep.
still in this line. We're still living this line,
And
and
then we move into other, you know, if we go even deeper than that, we can then talk about what's his name? Bruce Lipton wrote a book years
mm,
ago around epigenetics.
yes,
And epigenetics is like genetic memory, right?
mm,
Very simple explanation, genetic memory. And if we can accept the fact that there is this deep ancestral trauma that exists even in our genetics, then it stands to reason that certain parts of our personality, the way that we perhaps internalize things that happen and have in life, could be as a result of some of this internal, um, yeah, this internal ancestral trauma
mm,
and wounding
mm,
that
mm.
has happened from
I
years
know.
ago.
I know for me, sometimes I deal with things and I'm like, this is not even mine.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
even know where
I've
this
had
comes
that
from.
too. I've had
You
that
know, and
too.
I'm just
Yeah.
like going, I'm trying to kind of dig into my soul here to find where this is coming from. And I
Mm,
just don't have it. You
yep.
know, and I have to say, you know, I just need to surrender to whatever this is, because it's not mine. So I'm going to traverse it
Yep.
almost for the gift of my family line coming. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Right. Yep. Yep. Yep.
So
Yep. Yep.
it's almost to then not put whatever that causes within me onto my children, and not um, put it out into our environment as kind of like a collective
Yep.
energy. We are definitely traversing what we've been through as people through the ages,
Mm,
and I think if you look at World War II, and then we went pretty much straight away after, you know, about 10 years into Vietnam. And I mean, that was just, you know, stories I've heard from Vietnam are horrific. And then we've
yep.
had this break
Well,
where,
have we? Have we? Because then in the 80s there was the Cold War, if you
mm,
remember the Cold War,
yeah,
right?
the Falklands.
And whilst Yep. And whilst with the Cold War, there wasn't an actual battle that was fought. It was more of a psychological war because there
Mm.
was that imminent threat all the time of potentially World War III.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
people were reliving, and these people that were alive, which then as adults were children during the Second World War. So they're now reliving the fear, the anticipation of a potential war, and then all those memories of when they were kids, and there was, bombs, sirens going off, and their
Mm.
dads didn't come back from World War II, et cetera, et cetera, et
Mm.
cetera. And all this stuff would have come up for them too. So I don't know whether, and even recently, there's been this threat, over the last 10, 20 years of this war on terror
Mm.
and the terrorists, et cetera, et cetera, and that could create World War III. We've got China, we've got all sorts of things. Like,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure that we've ever actually come out of it. It's gone from as you said, a ground battle where you're literally man against man on the ground with guns, and then you go to an air battle, and then you've gone to the threat of nuclear war, and now it's all psychological.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
just wonder
Yeah.
if this is just a different progression of the same thing.
Mm. What's interesting is, I mean, I've obviously spoke to guys who were in Afghanistan as well,
Oh,
um,
there's that too. Yep.
and
Yep.
and in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, the trouble with that was the hypervigilance because it was
Yeah.
a sniper attack,
Yep.
and so that's so damaging,
Mm.
so. And it's a psychological thing because you're constantly
Oh,
terrified
absolutely.
you're about to be shot at
You're
any moment.
constantly in fight or flight mode. Your
That's
amygdala
right.
is
Yeah.
activated. Your body's being pumped with adrenaline. Like,
Mm.
it's not a good place to be in from a psychological perspective for
Mm.
long periods of time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Whereas in World War One, it was almost like, right, we're here and we know we're safe and we're walking in. They knew when they were going into battle, I suppose.
Yep. Yep.
And
Yep.
so I mean, each one of these, as we kind of discovering, has its own consequence. And
Mm.
and then one of my beliefs, I have to throw this in, is that after we kind of went through First World War, Second World War, and then that kind of 50s revolution,
Yep.
in the 60s there was this kind of like break to be free of all of this stuff, and then in the 80s we got comfortable. It's almost like we went
Mm.
out, we bought all this stuff,
Yep.
and we created a new kind of standard of living. And after kind of 30, 40 years of that, I think we're getting to the end of that, where we're going, it still didn't fix anything.
No, it didn't.
Now we've
Yep.
got all of just bigger houses and more conveniences, and
Yep.
less kind of
Consumerism, hey?
contact, and it's like we've made ourselves so comfortable. It's almost like we went on like a global retail therapy, to get over the
Yeah.
trauma of this. And
And I was going to
now,
say that.
yeah,
I
we've
was going to
come
say
back and
that.
gone, actually we're still fighting in these beautiful houses, and we're still
Yep.
abusing each other in these, while we've got a gorgeous car in the driveway, and
Mm,
we're
mm,
still not
mm.
getting along with our children who are in private schools. You
Yep.
know, we're starting to realize that overall, there's something else that needs to be done here, and I really feel that it's these battle scars and it's the war within, and
Yeah.
we're really battling that internal system now of all the traumatic events that haven't been allowed to be birthed. And of
Mm,
course,
mm.
as we know about masculinity, and that kind of like, take a spoon of cement. And then for women, stop being hysterical,
Yep.
that kind of narrative, where we're only allowed to be positive as well now in the past,
Mm.
10 years or so, and that we're not, no negatives around here, please.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God. So we're not even allowed to have.
Don't touch me with your victim.
That's right. That's right. Like, oh, you're having a bad day. Well, that's your shit. It's like,
Yeah.
well, no,
Yep. Yep.
maybe I'm
Yep.
just having a bad day.
Yeah.
So, it's really interesting to see how we have started to spill now. It's spilling out. And almost a way of controlling the spilling out was to make everybody feel that they had to be positive.
Mm.
And now we're
Isn't
also
it
getting to the end
interesting?
of that. We're also
Mm.
over that now. We're kind of going, we can't do the positive either. We can't buy
Yeah.
stuff. We can't be positive. We actually have to feel this stuff.
So isn't it interesting that we've just talked about the trauma of all the wars for half a century, you might as well say.
Mm,
And then we've moved into something a little bit different, which is about human rights. And then we go into something different after that, which is consumerism. And the consumerism is almost like putting a blanket or suppressing the ancestral trauma, the wounds that we've been talking about, the battle scars. And now we're finding that those layers of suppression, of materialism, haven't worked. And we've actually realized that there's a lot under the surface, bubbling under the surface, that we need to address and deal with. And that's starting to come to the surface now. And the way that we try to deal with that consumerism and the dissatisfaction within that is to, because as you know, the more you try to suppress something, the more it tries to force itself to the
mm,
surface. Then it was about positivity and et cetera, and just be positive and think positive, and let's do affirmations and gratitude, and that'll fix everything. And it does a lot of that,
it does.
but it still puts blankets over the top, doesn't it?
Mm,
It's still a layer of suppression over something that we haven't actually dealt with properly as individuals and a collective. And
mm,
so now, now we're dealing with this virus, so-called virus, whatever people want to believe. And now we're in fear, right? There's this fear of this airborne unknown thing. Plus, we're also in fear of each other, and we're in fear of our government, and we don't know who to trust. And that's almost an internal war, which is causing disruption as individuals and also as a society, because we're divided. And
mm.
so you kind of go, where does this all end? And I think where it ends is exactly where it begins, where it began, and that is with the self, right? With
And
the
human
self,
rights.
and well, just general humanity, right?
Mm,
And everyone being kind and being good and, and compassionate and doing things with integrity. Um, there's a lot of stuff in here, isn't there? There's
mm.
a lot of stuff around these
Huge.
battle scars and,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah.
ancestral wounds, emotional trauma. There's a lot of stuff, Helen.
Mm.
Yep.
And it really is interesting to dig through it, isn't it? Like and what's really interesting to me is looking at that and looking now that we are all trapped in these beautiful homes,
Mm,
in family units, really being, and what a lot of the conversation has been around the last 6 months is we're lucky to have this time together. And of course, as we know, that's not the case for a lot of people.
not for a lot of
It's
people,
it's
no.
very, very scary to be in that environment. But what we're really looking at is the consequences of our internal system shutting out all of the external influences to really be present with the scars, you
Yep.
know?
And that's
And
uncomfortable, isn't it?
so as a global community now, we're suffering the discomfort
Mm,
of what we carry within us.
yep.
And on top of that, now we're looking at how good we have had life and that we are starting to have our human rights removed. And we're kind of
Mm,
going, oh my God, there's
yep.
this kind of start to understand what is important, what isn't important. And you can't positive over that. You
No, you
can't kind
can't.
of buy yourself out of that.
Yep.
All of that is really interesting to me to see at 2020, that 2020 vision,
Mm,
the kind of almost that stop and reflect back on the past 100 years where we were in the middle of and we were just coming at the end of the First World War,
mm.
and it's really, we're kind of back to square one, aren't we,
We are,
in a way?
because our history has shown that we either fight our way through it or buy our way through it,
Mm,
right? And right now, we can't really do either of those two things. And so
mm,
we're left with ourselves, aren't we? And
mm,
our ability to be able to self-regulate, our ability to be able to manage our own emotions, to manage our own state, and really, it's really testing people in terms of how they are able to show up when there's nothing that can distract them.
mm, mm.
Yep.
Yeah. And this is what's really, as we know, the wellness industry is going crazy, and it's almost like of all industries, that's the one we need right now.
Yeah, and
um,
it's the one that's being the most ignored.
Yeah, and it's the one
Yep.
that's being kind of quashed as well,
Yep.
alternative medicines, etc. Yet this is the one thing that has stood the test of time, like the ancestral medical knowledge
Isn't it?
is
Isn't it?
unbelievable.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
yet
Yep.
our medical systems are
Mm.
overrun with obesity and cancers and heart disease and things like that are actually being caused by the suppression of emotion and
Yep.
of the battle scars that I think we're really dealing with. And so knowing all of that, we can almost just throw a whole blanket of compassion over everybody.
Yeah, we could, couldn't
Knowing that
we?
we're all kind of like, wow, look at what we're all dealing with,
Yep.
and we're all in here together, and let's see what we can do to help each other. But
Mm.
I fear that we're going the other way. So it would be really beautiful even to hear what our listeners think about
Yeah,
that,
I'd love to. I'd love to
how
hear
we
about that.
can um, whether there's anything we can do that would kind of like keep throwing the blanket of compassion over everybody around us who has been touched with
Yep.
all of these world events. I mean, we've not even
Mm.
touched on the Holocaust. We've not
Oh,
even
yes, of
gone
course, of course.
anywhere
Yeah.
near that. A
Yep.
whole kind of a whole section
Mm.
of our global community.
Yep.
Just
Yep.
purely from being that person. To be taken and have that kind of atrocity. And so all of these things that we kind of can hardly get our head around the
Mm.
kind of destruction of them.
It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it, Helen? Whilst we are dealing with what we're dealing with here in a first world country, it's very interesting to put some perspective around this and the stuff that we've been talking about today. I wonder how we would cope living a life like what our grandparents and great grandparents did. I wonder how we would cope, given the comforts, the conveniences, and everything that we have and experience and have in life. The comfort, the conveniences, and the consumerism, take all of that away. And I wonder if then we'd have something to complain about.
Mm. But
Mm.
it's interesting, right? If you think about what trauma does to a person, it removes their ability to cope.
Yep.
It means that they suppress it by becoming either addicted to pornography or alcoholism or
Mm.
gambling
Mm.
or sex addiction or whatever it
Yep.
is.
Or whatever it is. Yep.
Um, yeah, and then we go food addictions, etc. And as well, then we stop showing up properly in our possibility. We
Yep.
just get the one job, we stay in the one job, we're afraid to try anything else,
Mm.
stay in a relationship we're unhappy with, we kind of fight when we get drunk on a Saturday night, all of these kind of things.
Mm. Mm.
And
Mm.
so if you look at coming out of trauma, maybe as a community, we've all suppressed by getting the big house, getting this. And so we're all now in that point where we've not been able to cope from carrying the trauma.
Yep.
So it might not be that we've been softened by the conveniences, but it's almost like our system's already too full.
Yeah, right. And this in itself, again, it always comes back to the shadow, doesn't it? And in this part, and the context of what we're talking about, the shadow aspects are the rejected parts of ourselves, the parts that we're rejecting, the parts that we are saying, well, no, that's not me.
Mm,
No, that's not me. That's not part of me. That's not my personality. That's not my belief. That's not my whatever. And if we start to appreciate and acknowledge the fact that some of this stuff is, I would love for people to read Bruce Lipton's book on epigenetics. What was it called again? Do you recall what it
I
was
don't
called?
know. I don't know. I
Neither.
haven't actually read it myself.
Biology of Belief. The Biology of Belief. That was it. And that's a really interesting book to put some perspective and context around this discussion because it helps us to understand how um, ancestral wounds and patterns and emotional trauma from past generations can actually affect us on a genetic level now because we carry it in our very DNA. And so, yeah, and that's a really good thing for people to start to think about, I think. And if we were to start to wrap this up a little bit, I think that's a really good thing for people to realize that sometimes how they think, feel, and behave isn't always from them.
Mm,
It can be a leftover. It can be leftovers from a previous generation
mm,
and the trauma that was experienced. And
mm,
so we be kind to ourselves, as you said, a blanket of compassion over everybody,
mm,
and start to really connect with what we need to heal within ourselves. Because there's a really good saying, and I hope I don't mess this up, but the saying is something like, or the quote is something like, if we don't heal our wounds, we bleed on those who didn't hurt us.
yeah, yeah,
It's
that's
something
right.
like that anyway.
Mm.
Yep.
Hurt people hurt people.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're seeing that across the world at the moment,
Mm.
and it is bubbling over. It's
It
bubbling over
really is.
now. We're starting to riot against what we see happening, which is all the injustices and all the difficulties, all the uncomfortable stuff that's been brewing under the surface. We really
Yep.
are at a very key time in our history where the biggest impact we could all actually have is to come from a place of compassion.
Mm. Mm.
Because
And a place of selflessness as well,
mm,
because
mm,
where a lot of people are turning on each other,
yeah,
and
mm,
it's becoming dog eat dog out there. Survival of the
mm,
fittest almost. It
mm,
almost is becoming like a zombie apocalypse
yeah,
almost.
yeah.
Yep.
And it's funny, isn't it? It's difficult to go. I mean, to kind of go out and riot when there might be threat of arrest, or all of the fear factors around being seen to be fighting for whatever it is that we
Yep.
feel to be fighting for. So if we could
Mm.
just decide within ourselves that thing we can do, which is incredibly powerful, is to just care.
Yep.
That would
Definitely
have
a good place
an
to start.
enormous
Mm.
impact.
Absolutely.
And that shouldn't be hard, right? It
It
shouldn't be.
should be it should be easy, because at our I believe that at our core we all have this beautiful center of love and kindness, and at our essence we are good at
Mm,
our essence. And if
mm,
we start to believe that about ourselves and also other people, I think we can all have a better experience of life.
mm, mm.
Mm.
Yeah, and certainly by coming out with that feeling, the connectedness between us grows, our sense of belonging expands, and then
Yep.
that's actually unconscious healing already
Yep.
in place.
Yep. Exactly.
So yeah, that's really, and I think that's a gorgeous place to end on, Michael.
I think so too, Helen.
Unconscious healing.
Unconscious healing. Just get out there and do it.
Yeah, get out there and be nice. Well, God, I dare you.
Be kind.
Yeah, we set the dare of kindness. See if you can do
Yep. Yep.
it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool.
Yeah,
Awesome, Helen. Another
yeah,
good discussion.
sure. And we've got another few topics from that, I think. Yeah,
We definitely do. We'll
yeah,
be talking after this and taking some notes
yeah. And if
about where we
anybody
go.
who's listening has had something peaked while we've been talking, and they go, "Yeah, I'd like you to think about that more deeply, and I'd like you to investigate that one," please let us know on the notes at the bottom of the video.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thanks again, Helen.
Thank you. I'll see you soon, Michael. Bye, everyone.